Hi there. So, we're trying to build something great with Bold and Boutique. And the one thing that really helps is you hitting that follow button on Spotify. That single click makes a real difference and powers everything that we're doing here. Thank you so much. Let's get back to the episode.
So, in earlier episodes, we talked about how to conceptualize a virtual character and how to refine virtual characters, starting with a strong idea and then using qualitative research to get a better understanding how this idea resonates with the user. Now, once you've collected those insights, what happens next? How do you decide what ideas to move forward with?
Yeah, so once we have qualitative research results, we use them to optimize the most promising character designs. And these are usually the ones that show the strongest emotional or perceptual connection with the audience, with the customer. So it's not just about what people say they like, it's about understanding why they respond a certain way and then using that feedback to refine those ideas. And from there, we select a group of refined designs, ones that stand out and show like good potential. And those are like the concepts we continue to test in a quantitative research phase, which is the next step of the process.
Right. And before we dive into quantitative testing, let's take a look at the bigger picture. Why is it so important to first define a strong group of strong designs before diving into the next phase?
Yeah, so this is really about strategy and smart decision making. So, when you're designing virtual characters, the worst thing you can do is rush to scale like one concept just because it feels right. You don't want to make important design decisions based purely on opinions of a few people sitting around in a boardroom table, especially when you have the opportunity to actually test how different ideas perform in the real world. And it reminds me a bit of how traditional advertising used to work. So brands would like spend huge budgets on like a single ad concept, get a creative team to execute it, and then pour money into getting it seen by millions of people. But what if the video is just bad to begin with? Like no one's buying your product, and at that point, it's too late. The money is gone, and the opportunity has passed.
And even now, I believe a lot of companies are still working this way.
Absolutely. But I think there's like a smarter approach. I think in modern marketing, we see teams creating multiple ad variations and running tests to find out which one resonate the most naturally with the audience. And then they invest heavily in the top performers. And you see this everywhere from big brands to individual creators. Take someone like Stephen Bartlett, for example. His team often tests like different versions of podcast thumbnails and trailers to see which ones get the most engagement before rolling them out. And I've also seen industry experts who sell online courses doing things like this. They just don't launch one ad and hope for the best. They run multiple versions with different headlines, visuals, and even like voiceovers, then double down on the ones that drive the most conversion. And this approach is all about making smarter decisions based on customer feedback in their case. It's also about testing the algorithms of social media and distribution platforms to find out what works.
And you take inspiration from this and apply it to your design projects.
Yes, I guess kind of. But, you know, my point of view is very simple. I think I mentioned this before, but I see a design project as like a series of decisions that need to be made. And the research helps me to make better informed decisions. It gives us that confidence that we're putting our resources behind the designs with the strongest potential based on real data and not just creative instinct.
All right. So we've narrowed things down using qualitative research and we've refined promising designs. And now it's time to move on to the next phase. Can you walk us through what quantitative research actually brings to the table at this stage in the process?
Sure. So once we've done qualitative research and design refinements, quantitative research helps us answer a different kind of question. It's less about what people feel and why, but more about how do designs resonate and which ones perform better. So we're moving from rich, open-ended conversations to measurable comparisons. And the goal is to understand how different designs are perceived at scale. So we can make evidence based and knowledgeable design decisions about which ones to move forward with and develop and deploy.
So this is where you start comparing character designs and collecting actual data on which ones resonate.
Well, when you say actual data, I would argue that qualitative research gives us actual data too. It's just like a different type of data. And as I mentioned before, with qualitative research, we're gathering rich descriptive insights about how people interpret the design, how people feel, and respond to a design in their own words. It's a narrative, it's emotional, and it often reveals things we didn't even think to look for. That kind of data is incredibly valuable for exploration and refinement. And also at this stage, we're already comparing designs and specific design attributes that are interesting. But I get what you're saying. Of course, the quantitative data we gather here is much more structured. So it allows us to compare designs and measure perceptions at scale. And an important goal is to also uncover patterns across a much larger group of participants, because these patterns are very valuable for future design efforts. Before we dive back in, a quick word from our partner. Looking for a good podcast studio in Amsterdam? I record the Bold and Boutique podcast here at podcastproducties.nl. You see the backdrop, right? It gives you a minimal customizable style to fit the mood of your podcast. You can create videos looking as good as this in minutes. It's honestly quite easy. And you can get an engineer with every podcast you record. They're called podcastproducties.nl and they are ready for your show. Now let's continue.
Okay, let me rephrase. So you're continuing to compare interesting character designs by leveraging quantitative research, and you're basically collecting additional data on which ones resonate with customers.
Exactly. So for example, let's say you've got 5 refined designs for a virtual character. So in a quantitative study, we might test all 5 with a larger sample group and ask really structured questions about perception traits. Things like which of these characters seems the most confident, approachable, professional, etc. And we have smart ways of asking this, of course, and that's all part of the test design.
And which tools do you use to ask these questions?
We do this using tools like Qualtrics, for example, or other similar platforms that allows us to run structured surveys and perception tests. So respondents can give like ratings on these key attributes, sometimes using sliders, scales, visual comparisons, or other times picking cards, etc. And what we get back is clean, analyzed data that we can use to make better design decisions.
So at this point, you are not seeing what the people say, you only see what the numbers tell you, basically.
Yes, but I'll say this. I personally really like to combine these structured quantitative tests with moderated surveys. So in those sessions, we ask participants to think out loud while they go through the survey or compare different designs. And that format allows us to hear the reasoning behind the scores. So while we're collecting quantifiable data, like how trustworthy or expressive a character feels, we're also getting that extra layer of context in real time.
And are you doing this with every test participant?
No, that's not doable. We often do those moderated sessions with like a small percentage of the participants. So we select a diverse group and try to maximize a return on investment. But you're always working with a certain research budget and you're just trying to make the most out of that, of course.
And isn't that just doing additional qualitative interviews?
No, it's not the same as doing a full qualitative interview. Like moderated surveys are still structured and guided by like a defined test format, but the think out loud approach lets us catch things that numbers alone might miss, like confusion, hesitation, or like subtle emotional responses. It's sort of like this kind of hybrid method, I'd say, that helps us understand what people actually mean. And in practice, that can lead to much more precise design insights.
And how many people do you typically involve in a study like this?
So for a quantitative study, I usually want somewhere around between like 100 to 300 participants, depending on the scope. In my research or in my experience, that gives you enough data to identify trends and patterns that are interesting and meaningful.
That's quite a large range, though.
But in reality, if we compare projects, the range is probably even bigger because it does really depend on your research questions and the scope. So if you're just doing A/B tests between two designs, you don't need 300 people. But if you're comparing like 5 designs and you're testing multiple inputs, you'll probably want a larger sample to gain meaningful insights.
And how do you find the right participants? Are you looking for real users or just general participants?
Yeah, I think that depends. You can source participants through different types of platforms, and I must say they're all quite similar. One might have more options if you are searching for specific people or a specific user group, or if you need assistance in sourcing them, or if you want them to source the participants like fully for you. But sometimes such platforms aren't necessary. Some organizations also have their own kind of testing infrastructure, including protocols to source participants for user research. I remember one time I worked for an automotive app and we reached out to their customers to take the survey through the app. And in one day, we've got like 600 serious respondents, while the test was actually quite extensive with like people spending average of like 50 minutes to finish it. So yeah, it was quite impressive.
And what about diversity? I mean, how important is it that your sample group reflects different demographics, for example?
Super important, of course. If you target audience also reflect different demographics, if your participants all come from the same background, age group, region, etc., while your target audience doesn't reflect this, you have a problem.
Yeah, then your results are not very meaningful.
No, although they're still meaningful, but only for a specific group of people and not your target audience, your results won't scale. So if you're designing for a broad target audience, you need to consider distribution across gender, age, ethnicity, location, perhaps even personality types or customer segments, depending on the product and the brand, of course. And I think that's especially true if your AI character will be used globally across various contexts and use cases. Diversity really helps you to catch perception mismatches in that case.
What do you mean by perception mismatch?
Well, for example, if a voice speaks relatively slow, that might feel clear and warm to people in their 60s, but it might feel really unintelligent and lazy to people in their 20s. I'm just saying something here, of course. But without like that diverse participant base, you might completely miss that insight. And that's not okay if you're like designing something that both groups use.
So, in short, if you want meaningful data, you need enough participants, but that's not all. You also need like the right participants.
Exactly. Of course, quantity matters, but quality and relevance are what makes the data meaningful. So, if you're designing for teenagers, make sure your sample reflects the complexity of the perception of this group.
And once you've sourced the right participants, how do you actually design the test itself? Are you always using the same test, or are you like designing a different test for each project?
No, each context and client is different. Each study is different. So the data we're after is also unique for each project. So the way you frame questions really matters. And the design of your test can really make or break your results. If your questions are confusing, leading, or like inconsistent, you won't get clean data. You'll get just noise. So it's really important to define clear perception traits you want to measure and make sure every question is tied to a design goal. For example, if you want to evaluate how professional a character feels, you need to define what that means and how you're asking about it. So, are you using like a 7-point scale? Are you comparing multiple characters side by side, etc., etc.?
So, how do you define perception traits? I mean, I can imagine that everyone interprets those traits a little differently.
True. That's a very important challenge that we work on from the start since the foundational research phase. That's where it starts. That's where you need to define in detail how you want the character to be perceived, especially when it's a representation of the brand. So you start there and spend time perfecting the way you explain the traits to participants. In other words, you need to carefully operationalize them, which means turning like these abstract qualities into clear, testable questions.
And how do you do this?
Yeah, there are many ways to do this. For example, if you just ask, does this character seem friendly? You will have to explain friendly first to get good results. But you could also ask something like, on a scale from 1 to 7, how approachable or distant does this character seem? Whatever you want to do, just don't assume people understand your definitions.
And do you have any other tips or tricks for designing a good quantitative perception test?
Sure. So, first, I'd say consistency is very important. If you're comparing multiple characters, the question you ask participants needs to be identical for each design version, same wording, same order, same format, so the results are truly comparable. Also, don't make it too long. And just as importantly, don't make it feel too long. In my experience, a well-designed test should take around 15 to max 20 minutes. Because the truth is, if a test feels tedious or repetitive, people will start to tune out. They might start doing things in between and finish the test later. And the moment that happens, the quality of your data drops. Because if it starts like dragging on, they stop reading carefully and they'll start to rush through questions, etc., etc. So respecting the participants' time and keeping things focused makes a huge difference in the data quality. So you really want to respect the participants' time and attention. Keep it focused, keep it clear, and cut as much as possible.
How do you know if someone rushed through the questions or started doing something else in between, for example?
Oh, yeah. It's often very easy to spot these respondents in the data.
And what do you do when this happens?
Yeah, you have to assume that this happens. But once you start reviewing the results, you want to clean your data by excluding participants who didn't really engage. For example, if someone finishes a 20-minute test in 5 minutes, it's a red flag. Or if someone takes significantly longer than average, there's a good chance they left their screen, got distracted, didn't stay focused. That's usually a sign to exclude their results as well, because the data won't reflect real considerate input. Yeah. Before we get back to it, here is something you might find interesting. AI is powerful, but it can also get things wrong. A joke that doesn't land, a tone that feels off, a voice assistant that sounds polite in one country but rude in another. At Voice Branding, we help strategize brands and deploy AI solutions that fit different cultures, languages, and expectations. So your brand voice sounds great whether someone's in Tokyo, Toronto, or Berlin. Get it right everywhere. If you are interested in branding, design, and development strategy that scales, email me at phoebe@voicebranding.ai. That's PHOEBE at voicebranding.ai, and let's talk. Now let's continue.
So you're looking at response time.
Yeah, response time is a big one. And not just the completion time, you can also look at how long each respondent spent on the overall, and even how long they spend on individual questions. Like if there are huge gaps or inconsistencies, that's a good indicator that someone wasn't taking the test seriously. Having said this, I also recommend looking at response patterns. For example, if someone gives the exact same score across all questions, like all 5s or all 10s, it's also a sign that they weren't paying attention. You should probably exclude such results as well.
Now, circling back to designing the questions, how do you eventually decide how questions are asked?
Over time, you'll gain experience on what works, what doesn't. But if you are first starting out, I recommend reading a couple of books on user research, also looking into existing studies and their methods. This is also a very valuable source of inspiration and guidance. And of course, test your tests. So that's probably the best way to learn.
Now, if you think about it, it's very logical, of course. You test your questions, you're making sure that your test is performing well, that it's actually working before you send it out to a few hundred people.
Exactly. I highly recommend pilot testing, as you said before, launching a full-scale quantitative test. We always run a couple of small pilot tests, usually with colleagues or 5 to 10 participants. You want to find out if people are interpreting the questions correctly, if the flow is logical, if there are any technical glitches, etc., etc. Sometimes in a pilot test, you realize that one slider is not working or is confusing, or some browsers are not working with the test or whatever. So it can also be that a question is too vague or respondents are skipping important sections. You name it. So if you pilot test, you can really catch those things early on, and you can adjust them so the main study runs clean.
Okay. And I assume that these pilot tests are also moderated.
Yeah, that's how I like to do it. Watching people go through the test while they think out loud gives me the best insight into where friction points are. I sometimes also even ask fellow designers I like to work with to do the test themselves while I watch them go through it to collect their tips and feedback.
So to conduct an effective quantitative study, it's important to focus on getting the right participants, and you basically need to create clarity and flow through test design and pilot testing.
Yeah, pretty much. So if your test structure is clean and your participant pool is strong, you're in a great position to collect insights that are meaningful.
Now, let's say you've run the test. You've collected all the data. What happens next?
I just look at the design that won.
No, it's not that simple, is it?
No. Once we have the data, we don't just look at which character won. We go deeper. We start analyzing the relationship between perception data and design attributes. So we also do like subgroup analysis, and it's where correlation analysis also comes in. So let's say we've measured how trustworthy each character felt to users. We have also the metadata on each character's attributes, like the tone of their voice, pace of speech, color palette, eye shape, animation style. And now we ask, are there any patterns? Do characters with slower speech consistently score higher on trust, for example? Do brighter eye colors make a character feel more energetic? Does a soft-spoken voice come across as more intelligent or less confident? So these learnings really give us directions and recommendations to make meaningful design decisions.
So you're not just looking at which design performed well, you're also trying to unpack why it performed well.
Yes, and of course, qualitative research gives us a lot of insights on this as well. But quantitative results really also help. It's about uncovering if specific attributes drive certain perceptions. This gives you really insights that can create like a blueprint or guidelines, and not only to optimize the top performing character, but also to inform future design work, for example.
Can you give an example, like something you discovered in a project that shifted the direction?
Sure. So in one study, we noticed that characters with slightly like a lower pitched voice were constantly rated as more calming and reliable, especially by older participants. So that one insight led us to adjust the vocal design across several use cases. And the follow-up test confirmed a measurable improvement in perceived trustworthiness. But you can learn so many important things. For example, that a character's expression, just the angle of the eyebrows, impacts whether users perceive a character as more serious or friendly. Sometimes these like tiny changes can make like a big impact.
I understand. And do you also break down the results into subgroups to see how different types of people respond?
Definitely. It's so interesting to break down the data by different demographics or user traits like age, gender, location, profession, or even income. Whatever information you have, because like through subgroup analysis, you can start looking for patterns within each group. Often it's not just about what works overall. So you're also looking at who it works best for. I mean, let's say one character scores really high across the board, but when you dig into the data, you notice that younger users rate them significantly lower than older users. So that insight could influence how you approach or adapt characters in different touch points, for example.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, research and data analysis take the guesswork out of it, right? You're not just throwing ideas out there. You can actually base your design decisions on something real.
Absolutely. And don't get me wrong, we don't do research to remove creativity, which people sometimes think is happening. It's simply about supporting creativity with insights. So we're creating a broader perspective and making the designs more user-centered. The research really turns emotional, subjective thoughts and ideas into meaningful design logic, and that logic scales.
What do you mean by that logic skills?
Well, you're not just testing what works now, you're building a knowledge base that can be leveraged for future design efforts. Every insight you get, whether it's a voice trait that signals trust, emotion style that feels energetic, or a visual cue that improves relatability, it becomes part of something larger. When I say the logic scales, I mean, you're creating a foundation of tested, validated insights that teams can refer to across different projects, products, or even markets. Instead of starting from scratch every time or relying purely on creative instinct, you're able to build on something real. And when you work across multiple teams, that shared foundation becomes incredibly powerful. It streamlines collaboration, reduces misalignment, and really helps everyone to speak the same language when it comes to design decisions. I've built some workshops and training programs for people who are interested in character design in the AI era. If you are working in branding, UX design, content marketing, or product development, and you are interested in learning more about virtual influencers, brand ambassadors, and AI characters for products and services, take a look at our one-day training or my extended 5 or 10-day programs, where you will learn how to craft effective brand characters with strategy, creativity, and purpose. Visit boldandboutique.com for more information. That's it from us. My name is Phoebe O'Hayan, and thanks for listening.